Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into a story that might seem like just another chapter in Middle Eastern history. But trust me on this one. This one's got it all: family drama, political intrigue, and a whole lot of international tension. We're talking about the Qatar coup attempts of 1995 and 1996. Ever wonder why Qatar kind of goes its own way in a region that's, pretty much dominated by Saudi Arabia? Well, these events, they're a big part of the story, and today we're going to uncover why.
What gets me about this is how these events, right? Like, they seem like internal power struggles at first glance, but they really had a huge ripple effect across the whole region.
Yeah.
We're talking about Qatar, right? A relatively small nation deciding it was time to step out of the shadow of, well, a giant like Saudi Arabia. The decisions made during this time, they still resonate today, shaping alliances and rivalries that, they impact global politics even now.
Okay, so to get this right, to really understand this, we need to set the scene. Like, what was the Gulf like before 1995? Who were the major players and what were the power dynamics like back then?
Okay, so picture the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. It's like this exclusive club of Arab Gulf states, and you've got Saudi Arabia, right? The undisputed heavyweight. They've got huge economic and political clout. The expectation was that smaller states like Qatar, well, they would generally fall in line with Saudi Arabia's leadership. And at that time, Qatar had immense potential. They have all that natural gas, but they hadn't yet turned that wealth into the kind of international influence they have today.
So almost like a hierarchy within the GCC.
Yeah.
And then, boom, June 27, 1995, everything changes.
Yeah.
Sheikh Ahmad bin Khalifa Al Thani takes over, but not in, a typical election or succession. This was a coup, right? He ousted his own father, Sheikh Khalifa, no less. That's some serious family drama.
Yeah, it was swift and bloodless. And yeah, the family dynamics are a big part of this whole story. Sheikh Khalifa was actually on vacation in Switzerland at the time, which made things a bit easier for Sheikh Ahmad. But it wasn't just opportunity Sheikh Ahmad. He had a lot of support within the Qatari government and the military. This wasn't just a power grab. He had a vision for Qatar's future.
So it wasn't just a son being impatient to take over. There were deeper motivations at play here.
Yeah.
What was Sheikh Ahmad's vision for Qatar, and how did it differ from his father's approach?
Well, Sheikh Ahmad, he believed that Qatar needed to forge its own path, one that wasn't, dictated by Saudi Arabia. He wanted a truly independent foreign policy, free from the constraints of those traditional alliances within the GCC. This meant diversifying partnerships, reaching out to countries that Saudi Arabia might not be so happy with. But it also meant, making some bold moves to develop Qatar's economy and modernize the country. And of course, there was the goal of leveraging all that natural gas, turning Qatar into a major player on the global energy stage.
That's a huge shift in direction. I bet that didn't sit too well with the rest of the GCC, especially Saudi Arabia. What was their reaction to this sudden change in leadership and this new vision for Qatar?
Let's just say they weren't thrilled, Saudi Arabia, along with the UAE. They saw this as a challenge to their dominance in the region. Bahrain and Egypt, while not GCC members, they were also worried about potential instability. They all started putting pressure on Qatar, diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, essentially trying to isolate them and force Sheikh Ahmad to back down.
So right away, you have this feeling that Qatar is shaking things up, creating ripples that are going to spread throughout the region. But it sounds like things were just getting started. This first coup, this shift in power, almost like lighting the fuse for even more drama to come.
You could say that. And what happened in 1996? Well, that really shows how high the stakes had become. We'll get into that soon. But the failed counter-coup attempt that year, that was a turning point. It really solidified Qatar's resolve to go their own way and forced them to make some pretty daring moves to secure their future.
So we've got Qatar making these bold moves, really going for that independence. And it's pretty clear their neighbors aren't exactly thrilled about it. So what happened next? Did Saudi Arabia and its allies just sit back and watch?
Oh, no, they did not.
Things got way more intense in 1996 with a pretty audacious attempt to undo the 1995 coup. This operation, it was called Operation Abu Ali, and the goal was to put Sheikh Khalifa back in charge and basically put an end to Qatar trying to act so independent.
A counter-coup. Less than a year after the first one. That's bold. Who was behind it? Were they just going to sneak Sheikh Khalifa back in and pretend nothing happened?
It was a lot more complicated than that. Think of it like a big coordinated effort with a bunch of different players involved. You had people inside Qatar who were still loyal to the former emir, like tribal leaders, and even some military officers. But the real power behind it, the support for this counter-coup, it allegedly came from Qatar's neighbors, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt.
Wow, that's a serious accusation.
Yeah.
What kind of evidence was there to back up this claim of foreign involvement? Well, those countries, they've always denied being directly involved. But at the time, the Qatari government, they presented evidence that suggested weapons were being smuggled into the country from Saudi Arabia. And they also said they captured foreign agents who were supposedly part of the plot.
Okay, so we're not talking about some small internal rebellion here. This was potentially a major international incident, with covert operations and foreign powers meddling in Qatar's affairs. So what exactly was this Operation Abu Ali all about? What was the plan to overthrow Sheikh Hamad?
Operation Abu Ali was this multifaceted plan. They wanted to quickly take control of all the important government buildings in Doha. It involved using a mix of troops that were still loyal to the old emir within the Qatari military and also armed insurgents that would sneak into the country. Intelligence reports from back then even suggest that sophisticated communication equipment and small arms were being smuggled across the border, which tells you it was very organized and had outside support.
Sounds like that could have been really dangerous. What if the counter-coup had worked? What kind of impact would that have had on Qatar and the whole region?
If it had worked, it could have been a disaster. The region was already really tense, and a violent power struggle in Qatar could easily turn into a much bigger conflict. You can imagine the chaos, civil unrest, regional instability, and of course, it would have disrupted vital energy supplies.
It sounds like this counter-coup was a huge risk with potentially massive consequences. So tell me, how did it actually play out? Did they come close to pulling it off?
It's actually kind of surprising, but no. It seems Qatari intelligence got wind of the plan pretty early on, and they moved fast to stop it. They made a bunch of arrests ahead of time, rounding up hundreds of people they suspected were involved, including those military officers and the alleged foreign agents we talked about.
So they basically shut the whole operation down before it could even begin.
Yeah,
That's impressive. It seems like Sheikh Hamad was really prepared for this kind of challenge.
he was. And that's directly because of the 1995 coup. Remember, one of Sheikh Hamad's main goals was to make Qatar independent, and that meant making national security a top priority, especially with all the tension with their neighbors.
So in a way, that first coup, which was already a pretty big move, accidentally helped prevent the second one. Interesting twist. But what about the fallout from this failed counter-coup? I'm guessing it didn't just disappear quietly.
Oh, you're right about that. The fact that this counter coup even happened was a huge hit to whatever trust was left between Qatar and its neighbors. It basically threw gasoline on an already burning fire, that regional rivalry.
Okay, I can imagine the tension.
Okay.
So what was Qatar's response? Did they confront their neighbors directly about their supposed involvement?
They did. Qatar publicly accused Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt of being behind the whole thing. As you can imagine, that caused a big diplomatic mess and made things even worse between the Gulf countries.
So at this point, Qatar had survived 2 attempts to get rid of Sheikh Hamad. What did they do next? Did they try to keep a low profile and avoid making their neighbors even angrier?
Nope, not at all. This whole thing seemed to just make Qatar even more determined to be independent. They realized that depending on their neighbors for security wasn't an option anymore. They had to create their own path, even if it meant going against the way things were usually done in the region.
So what did that look like? How did Qatar actually assert this newfound independence and, more importantly, protect themselves from more threats?
They made some strategic moves focusing on strengthening their defenses and expanding their influence internationally. First, they seriously beefed up their military, investing in new equipment and training to make sure no one would attack them again. They also focused on improving their internal security, making their intelligence operations better so they could spot and prevent any threats from within.
Makes sense given what they'd just been through.
Yeah,
But I'm guessing that wasn't all.
you're right. They also did something that would really shake things up in the region and put them on the map in a whole new way. Remember, Sheikh Hamad's other big goal was to modernize Qatar and make it a bigger player on the world stage. Well, they decided to do this partly through a new media project.
Interesting. What did they do? Start a state-run news agency or something like that?
They went way bigger. In 1996, the same year as that failed counter-coup, Qatar launched Al Jazeera.
Wait, Al Jazeera, the international news network, that started as a Qatari thing. I had no idea.
It did, and it was a total game changer. Al Jazeera got known really fast for its hard-hitting reporting. They often challenged the stories coming from governments in the region, especially Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
Like, that's bold, especially given how tense things already were with those countries.
Yeah.
What was their reaction to Al Jazeera's critical coverage?
They were furious. They saw Al Jazeera as a direct attack, accusing them of spreading propaganda and trying to weaken their authority. It became this huge point of contention in that rivalry between Qatar and its neighbors.
So this wasn't just about family drama or even who had more power anymore. This was about different ideas, a battle to be the most influential on a global scale. Qatar was challenging the way information was controlled and spread in the whole region.
Exactly. And Al Jazeera showed that Qatar was changing their approach. They weren't going to play by the old rules anymore. They were actively trying to shape this story and make it clear that they were a force to be reckoned with both in the region and internationally.
This is fascinating. We've gone from a coup in a palace to a counter-coup with international intrigue, and now Qatar is using the media to challenge how power works in the region. It feels like a whole new era is starting in the Gulf. So what happened next? Did these simmering tensions ever boil over into a full-blown crisis?
Oh, they did. And more than once. The consequences were huge, not just for Qatar and its neighbors, but for the whole region and even global politics.
Last time we were talking about how Qatar launched Al Jazeera, and that definitely, added fuel to the fire in their rivalry with Saudi Arabia and its allies. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was about influence on a global scale.
Yeah.
So how did things play out after Al Jazeera started?
Well, there are these ups and downs, attempts to make peace, but that underlying mistrust never really went away. Then in 2014, you have the first big diplomatic crisis. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, they recalled their ambassadors from Qatar, basically cutting off communication at the top level.
So like a full-blown diplomatic freeze-out. What were they accusing Qatar of this time?
They said Qatar was supporting Islamist groups, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, which they saw as a threat to their power. To understand why this was such a big deal, you got to understand Islamism in the region. Islamism, generally speaking, is a political ideology that says Islam should play a bigger role in public life. The Muslim Brotherhood is one of the most influential Islamist movements in the Arab world. They have branches in tons of countries, and they push for political reform, often through democratic means. But some Gulf monarchies see them as dangerous, like they could undermine their authority.
So by supposedly supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar was kind of messing with the status quo, challenging the way things were in the Gulf.
Yeah.
How did the rest of the world react to this diplomatic standoff?
It was mixed. Some countries tried to be peacemakers, urging everyone to calm down. Others picked sides, aligning themselves with either Qatar or the Saudi-led group. It was a tricky situation trying to deal with this complex regional stuff without making things worse.
Sounds like everyone was walking on eggshells. Did things ever calm down after that 2014 crisis?
Not really. It was more like a pause, not a real peace. The main problems were never really solved, and that distrust was still there. Then in 2017, boom, things blew up again, and this time it was even more dramatic.
Okay, I knew it. I knew things were going to get serious. What happened in 2017?
June 2017, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, they did something drastic. They announced they were cutting off all diplomatic ties with Qatar, and they imposed a complete blockade by land, sea, and air.
A full blockade. That's cutting a country off from the world. That's a huge escalation. What reasons did they give for something so extreme?
They repeated those accusations that Qatar was supporting terrorism. Now, that word gets thrown around a lot, but in this case, it was mostly about Qatar's supposed support for groups like Hamas in Palestine and some factions in the Syrian civil war groups that those countries consider terrorists. They also accused Qatar of meddling in their internal affairs, spreading dissent, and being too friendly with Iran, which is Saudi Arabia's biggest rival.
So it wasn't just about the Muslim Brotherhood anymore. They were saying Qatar was destabilizing the whole region. What did Qatar do? Did they try to negotiate, or did they stand their ground?
They completely denied everything, calling the blockade illegal and saying it violated international law. They said it was an attempt to bully them into giving up their sovereignty, and importantly, they didn't give in to the pressure.
That must have taken guts standing up to those powerful countries. How did they manage to survive being cut off like that?
They adapted. They quickly found new trade routes, mostly through Turkey and Iran, that let them keep importing essential stuff and keep their economy going despite the blockade. It also showed how important it is to have different partners. By not depending only on their neighbors, they were able to get through it.
So Qatar found help through Turkey and Iran, which is interesting because they also have complicated relationships with Saudi Arabia. It's like this whole web of alliances and rivalries.
Yeah. Exactly. And it shows how smart Qatar was to build relationships outside of their immediate neighbors. It also proves that even when facing huge pressure, smaller countries can find ways to survive and even do well if they have the right strategies and the right friends.
What did the rest of the world think about this blockade? Did anyone try to step in and help the two sides work things out?
Lots of countries were worried about the humanitarian impact of the blockade, and they wanted a peaceful solution. Kuwait, another GCC member, they really tried to mediate, but the core issues were just too hard to resolve.
So like a stalemate. This tiny country, Qatar, standing up to some of the most powerful countries in the region, it's a real David and Goliath situation playing out on a global stage. How did it finally end?
It took years of diplomacy, but eventually they reached a sort of peace agreement in 2021. It's called the Al-Ula Agreement, and it led to Saudi Arabia and its allies lifting the blockade and restarting diplomatic relations with Qatar.
That sounds hopeful.
Huh.
Everyone's happy now. Did the Al-Ula agreement actually fix the problems that caused this whole rivalry in the first place?
It's not that easy. The Al-Ula Agreement was a big step towards calming things down, but it didn't really address the root of the conflict. It was more like a ceasefire than a real peace treaty. That underlying mistrust and the competition to be the most influential in the region, they're still there.
So this whole saga that started with those coup attempts in 1995 and 1996, it's still affecting the Gulf region.
Wow.
What's next for Qatar and its neighbors? Can they get past their differences and create a more stable region?
That's the big question. Will they keep competing or will they find ways to work together for everyone's benefit? What we've talked about today shows that even countries that seem small can have a huge impact on the world. And in a region as volatile and important as the Gulf, the choices these countries make are going to have major consequences.
This deep dive has been a wild ride through political drama, family power struggles, and international diplomacy at the highest level. It reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of dates and events. It's a story that's still being written and still affects us all. What are your thoughts on all of this? What can we learn from Qatar's experience? Let us know and join us next time as we uncover more fascinating stories that help us understand the world around us.